Hello everybody and welcome to the YouTube channel of Skip Allen. This video is in response to a question I saw at Painter Factory about paint thickness. And Iron Man tells us that he's been working with ArtRage on his iPad and he gets a thicker paint or paint amount is increased by increasing what they call loading. He hasn't been able to find a brush that he likes best. And he wants to know how to thicken the amount of paint on the brush. That's his main question. But he also says that he doesn't really understand resaturation, bleed, and feature. Okay, so let's see what we can do to get him on the right track, or get me on the right track even. First thing I'm going to do is I'm going to open up ArtRage. In ArtRage, there's a brush called Oil Brush. And if you paint with the oil brush, you will see, oops, let me reset that. If you paint with the oil brush, you'll see that it does have, it's painting with thick paint. Now in Painter, we refer to that as painting with impasto. Okay, so he said that if you increase the loading, it will make the paint thicker. Maybe it does, but it doesn't look like that's what makes it thicker to me. What I think I would do is I would reduce the thinner, and that would definitely make the paint a lot thicker. But what this is showing is that ArtRage is similar to Painter in that there are multiple sliders, and you have to work with multiple sliders in order to get the brush to work the way you want to. Okay, so we come over to Painter. Now, if you're new to Painter, and I'm assuming Iron Man is, I don't know that for a fact, but if you're new to Painter, the 700 plus brushes is kind of daunting to go through and find a brush that you like. But if you're looking for a brush that paints with thick paint, try going up here to the brush search feature and typing thick. When you do that and search, you're going to get a whole bunch of brushes with the word thick in their name. Now, not all of these will paint with thick paint or impasto, but most of them will. And that's exactly what I did is I grabbed a brush called Thick Wet Camel because that's going to paint with impasto. Now, before we get to impasto, though, I want to talk about the resaturation, bleed, and feature. And what I have set up here is I have a layer that I've locked with 3 lines running across it, 3 stripes. Then I have a second layer that I'm going to paint on, and it is set up with Pickup Underlying Color. And I mentioned that the brush I'm working with is Thick Wet Camel. Okay, now, in order to tell what happens to the brush when we change the sliders, it's a good idea to come up to brushes and work with record stroke and playback stroke, these 2 commands here. Now, I've put the commands on a custom palette so that I don't have to go up there to do it. And if you click on record stroke, when you make a stroke, that stroke is going to be recorded. So I'm just going to make a quick stroke like that. Now, the stroke was recorded. I come over to playback stroke, click on it, and then if I touch the canvas, the recorded stroke is played back. So now I have a stroke that is identical every time I play it. But if I make some sort of change, like if I come up here to opacity, and I reduce the opacity, that's a little bit too much, to about 28%, and then touch, I can see what happened to the brush stroke. I can tell the difference that the change has made. So let's go back up to the default. We'll get rid of those, and we'll leave the brush 1 stroke at the default setting. Now I'm going to come up to Advanced Brush Controls, and I'm going to open those up, and I want to call your attention to the Well control. In the Well brush control panel, you have resaturation, you have bleed, and you have dry out. Notice that they're separated by these lines. That means they're separate commands, but they're all related because they're in this same panel. Okay, now what is resaturation? Resaturation is according to the help manual, it's replenishing the paint. So the higher the number for resaturation, the more you would be replenishing the paint as you stroke. Bleed is defined as smearing the underlying paint, that its function is to smear the underlying paint. And dry out is like what it sounds. It sets up how quickly the brush is going to dry out. It will continue smearing, but it won't add any more paint. Now, dry out is unavailable to us with the thick wet camel, so we're only working with bleed and well. Okay, so how do they work? Well, I've got my bleed set up here really high and my resaturation really low, yet when I do my brush stroke, I don't see any bleed, and all I see is resaturation. Well, that's kind of what happens to a lot of folks, is that they think bleed is not doing anything because they've made a stroke and they don't see anything. But you have to look at something else. The expression for resat is on pressure. The expression for bleed is also on pressure, but it has an extra little part here. The invert bleed expression is on. So that means with light pressure, bleed would be very strong, but with heavy pressure, resaturation is still going to be strong. So I'm going to take my playback stroke off, and I'm going to make a stroke with very light pressure. Now look at that. See, it's smearing the paint, as you would expect, because bleed is at 100%. I'm doing light pressure, and well only comes in, resaturation only comes into play if the the pressure is heavy. So as I increase, see, there's light pressure. As I increase my pressure, you see more color coming into play. All right, so that's shows you that bleed does work, but you've got to pay attention to pressure, whether we're working with light or heavy pressure. Now, if I take this off and I do my brush stroke, whoops, let's go back to playback. Take it off, look. See, now this is heavy pressure, and my bleed is at 100%, so it's much stronger at heavy pressure than my resaturation is. So I'm getting mostly bleed. Increase that resaturation, I'm not going to get bleed. And bleed is so strong, I don't have to increase it very far for it to start taking over. But see, you're beginning to see with this 32%, I'm seeing some smearing and color at the same time. Okay, so resaturation is strongest over bleed, but pressure can affect the way these work. Now, I'm not going to talk about men resat and men bleed because it would make the video very long, and I don't think it's all that important for right now. Okay, so let's go to feature. I'm going to take the brush back to its original default setting. The feature for this brush is 3.9. What that means, it's in the bristles panel, and feature is talking about bristles, and it's bristle density that it's talking about. So if you think of bristle density, it means it's kind of like how many bristles per inch or something like that. But anyway, with 3.9, that's what you get. Now, if you increase the feature size, it decreases the bristle density. If you decrease the size, it increases the bristle density. It's just the opposite of the way it logically would think. Now, the help menu tells you it's the other way, but it's not. So if I take this feature and I increase it to, say, 8, and I come over here and do my brush, you can see that the density of bristles is much less. If I take it back, we were at 3.9, so let's take it to 2.9 and hit it. Now you're going to see that the density of bristles is really high, okay? So that's what that's about. Now, if you want to know about the scale, the feature, let's take it back to its original size. We're at 3.9. If I increase the size from 30 to, say, 40 up here, and I do my little recorded stroke playback, notice that the density of the bristles stays pretty much the same, or it is the same, really. Now, if I go back to the original and I take off scale feature and I increase my brush size to 40, the feature stays the same, and so when I paint, notice that now my bristle density has increased. If I make it bigger even, the bristle density is going to increase even more. Unlike if I go back to the original and I leave the scale set and I increase this up, notice that the feature density increases, so it stays the same no matter what size the brush is. That's what scale is about. Okay, now let's go to the impasto panel. The impasto panel has lots of sliders, but we're only going to talk about a couple of them. Now, let's look at the way, let's take the brush back to its original, and let me take off playback stroke, and we'll paint some with it. Notice that I'm getting impasto with the brush, okay? Now, what's causing that is this first slider, or first drop-down menu, which says color and depth. It's draw to color and depth. You have color, depth, or color and depth. Color and depth means that you're going to get impasto plus the color. Depth means you're just going to get the impasto. So if I put that down, I'm getting impasto in there, but you're not going to have any color. If you do it just with color, there's no impasto that's going to show up. See, no impasto there. The reason we saw some impasto here when I went over it was because that's where I'd gone over it with the depth only. Okay, so let's go back and we're going to do color and depth. Now you have uniform method, and that's the one you will normally see, but there's some other good ones in here that you ought to play with. Now I'm going to go down to the depth slider because that's the next most important thing to worry with. We have the depth at 5%. Now that's what it looks like at 5%. Let's go back to our playback stroke. So we're at the default and we play it in. Now if I take this slider here and increase it to 15 and I do the same stroke, look, it's much thicker. Now it also has some sort of raggedy looking stuff going on with it, and the deeper that you get, let's go to 50, the more that shows. But you can adjust that using some of the other sliders. For instance, if you take the smoothing all the way up and reduce the plow, smoothing is going to smooth it out some, and reducing the plow means that it will plow into another stroke. Now it's at 50%. It's not going to do a lot, but it does smooth it out a little bit. But if we take it back down to 5%, our default, now look how much smoother that looks than the original. And so I usually increase my smoothing and decrease the plow. Also, your depth is set up with pressure. If so, the more pressure you set up, the thicker the paint will become. Okay, let's see if we can't do something to this one to make it a little bit better. Let's take it back to its original, take off playback stroke, and I want to get rid of some of that sort of streakiness there. So I'm going to increase the smoothing, drop down the plow, and that's what we see. And then I'm going to take the feature and reduce the feature to 2. Yep. Okay. And when I reduce the feature to 2, now it's not quite as streaky as it was, and I've got heavier impasto. So what I'd want to do here is drop the depth to about 3, and I'm beginning to get a brush that I could probably use as with thick paint. So that's what you do. You sit here and play with these sliders, set up your playback stroke, and see what the sliders tell you. Now, do go and look at the manual. It will definitely help you in trying to figure this stuff out, but you have to read it while you're trying to play with the strokes and notice all those different things. I mean, the reason I wanted to go to thick wet camel was because of the oddity here, to show you that under most circumstances, you're not going to see anything happen with the bleed unless you're painting really lightly. Okay, hope that helps. Talk to you later. Bye-bye.